Imagine that you're walking through a field, like just the field across the street. Think about that. You're walking through a field and you stumble onto a watch. You just find it in the field. What are the questions that come to your mind? Whose watch is it, right? That might be a good, yeah, I wonder whose this is. What else might you think? I mean, besides, like, where's the nearest pawn shop? Because, like, that's a Rolex, right? This is a picture of an actual Rolex. This belongs to a friend of mine. I asked him if I could tell the story just quickly, but he got this watch from his dad about 30 plus years ago, and his dad had gotten it from his brother in post-World War II Europe. It was a vintage 1953, 1954 Rolex, so his brother gave it to his dad. The dad's brother gave it to him, and then he gave it to my friend with the blessing of, you can sell this anytime you want, and it could be an investment, or you can keep it. You can do what you want with the money. A couple of years ago, he decided to sell it, and he sold this watch for a little over $150,000. I know, right? Yeah, he made a down payment on a house. He took his mom and his in-laws and his sisters and his kids all to Hawaii. It was a great thing, right? That's a nice thing to stumble onto. But what if you had never seen a watch before? Like, what if you'd never seen a watch? This was the first one you ever saw. What would the questions be then? Would they be different? I mean, maybe some of the questions would be, how did it get here? Who does it belong to? That would maybe be a simple question. How did it get made? And then, what does it do if you'd never seen one? Right? I mean, we've all seen watches, we've seen clocks, and we know what they are. And so when we see the one, probably for the most part, we don't think a lot about it. But I want to think about the watch just a little bit later. So put a bookmark in that for just a minute. We started last week with this painting, reflecting on the painting and asking the question, like, what are the questions that this creates? I mean, and we went through some of those. Who painted it? It was Van Gogh, 1889. What's behind the imagery, the interesting contrast between the sky and the village and the cypress tree in the foreground, and why are the church windows dark? And so we're asking these questions because we assume that there's something behind the artist's picture. It's not just random. The artist is trying to say something. In many cases, we recognize that when we study art, there's a message in the art. And if we study artists, particularly over time, we start to see their signature in their work. And you can see a painting of somebody that you're familiar with. You go, oh, that looks like a Van Gogh, because there's a signature. Their fingerprints are on it. And so we recognize that about art. And so while we can't prove God's existence like we could prove 2 + 2 = 4, we can see God's fingerprints in the world. We can see the signature of design. And so I want to keep on thinking about that a little bit this morning. But before we get on with that, I just want to revisit a little bit a couple of definitions and kind of what we said last week. We won't go into detail, but I want to start with this definition of scientific naturalism, because it's kind of an important definition. The scientific naturalism is the conjunction of naturalism, that is the claim that nature is all that there is, and hence that there are no supernatural order above the universe, above nature, with the claim that objects, processes, truths, and facts about nature fall within the scope of the scientific method. So on scientific naturalism, nature is all that we have, and the only way to figure it out and find out about it is by the scientific method. The second definition is the definition for the inference to the best explanation. And that the definition for inference to the best explanation is the procedure of choosing the hypothesis or theory that best explains the available data. The factors that make one explanation better than another may include depth, comprehensiveness, simplicity, and unifying power. Basically, this is, what's the simplest answer? Like Occam's razor, maybe. Take the simplest answer. Often, we think about this in hermeneutics with Scripture. Like, we can go deep into Scripture, but sometimes it's good just to read and go, well, what do we think it means when Jesus says, love your neighbor? It might mean, love your neighbor. It might not be any more complicated than that. So, what's the simplest thing? How do we get to that? The inference to the best explanation is, given all that we know about a thing, what's the best explanation for what it means? And some people think, as Richard Dawkins thinks, who's one of the foremost scientific atheists in the world, that the inference to the best explanation is that we live in a universe that's random. Right? He wrote that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That is one view of the world, but it's not the primary way that most people see the world. The majority of people don't see it that way in the world, but we have to keep thinking about that question, and we need to think about it seriously. I've been spending a lot of time over the last month and a half or two listening to lectures, and I'm interested in this stuff anyway, but Stephen Meyer, who wrote the Return of the God Hypothesis, I've been listening to him do interviews, and what's been fascinating to me is I've listened to him be interviewed by some really confrontive sort of interviewers. Not confronting him, but trying to get him to make fun of the people who argue with him. You know, that's kind of the culture we live in. We can just start poking fun at each other, then, you know, that'll be helpful somehow. Somebody thinks that. What's been fascinating is that Steve Meyer he never buys into it. He never gets pulled into that. He takes every person seriously. And so I think that's really important for us to recognize that people think differently than we do, and it's okay, but it's also okay for us to think differently than them, and we can talk about that, and we don't have to make fun of each other because we want to take people seriously. We want to love people well, and that means taking people seriously. But the question that we want to keep asking is, given all that we observe, is it more likely that the world in which we live came about by blind, purposeless, and pitiless indifference, or that the world exhibits characteristics of design, purpose, and beauty that point to a designer? So is the theory of scientific naturalism, and along with it Darwinian evolution, the best explanation for the world that we're living in? There are good scientific, philosophical, and theological reasons to believe that that isn't the way things are, that we didn't come about just by blind, random chance, but that, in fact, everything we see is the creation of an intelligent mind. So the arguments that we were thinking about last week and that we're going to think about today, they're not arguments specifically for a Christian God, if that makes sense. We're not going to get there quite yet. What we're trying to discover is, are there reasons to believe that God exists, that theism? Are there reasons to believe that theism is a likelier case than atheism? And so Meyer's writing in The God Hypothesis tells us that there are three historic metaphors that have been pointed to as a way of seeing God in the world. Three historic metaphors: the book of nature, a clock, and a law-governed realm. These are three classic arguments for the existence of God. We see God in the book of nature, we see God in design or a clock, and in a law-governed universe or God-governed realm. We looked at two arguments last week. The first was the Kalam cosmological argument, and here's the basic argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe exists, it began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and the cause is necessarily outside the system. Right? So whatever begins to exist had a cause. We know the universe began to exist because we're in it and we can observe it. Therefore, the universe has a cause, and that cause is outside the universe because you can't cause, it has to be whatever cause that's outside the system. I said last week, I couldn't cause myself because I wasn't here to cause myself. So that whatever is the cause is outside the system. And Christianity goes even further to say that there's an eternal, personal, changeless, all-powerful, benevolent creator outside the universe that created God, and God did not have a beginning. Like this, and that's because God's not an event, God's not a thing, God's a person whose nature is eternal, who is outside of this. He's the uncaused causer. And so we could talk more about that, but that's the essence of the argument, that God is not an event, or God is not a thing, like you are not an event or a thing. You're a person, and persons have characteristics in nature, and so does God. The second argument that we talked about was specifically from the book of nature, and we just said we see God in and throughout nature. We see it everywhere in the artistry of nature. Nature, as we observe it, looks like artistry, and it looks like design. But we also find within our human nature, our human persons, the sense of God. Remember, we were talking about Alvin Plantinga, the sensus divinitatis, that there's a sense of God in all human persons. It's woven into the very fiber of our humanity. And Plantinga makes the argument that that's a proof that we can look at for the existence because it's universal, it's ubiquitous. Every every culture and tribe and tongue and of every time is drawn to worship someone. And so Plantinga said that's the sensus divinitatis. That's what Calvin called it. And the most simple way to look at it is it's to know in a general and confused way that God exists is implanted in us in nature, in our very nature. So what that means, like, to know in a general and confused way just means this. You don't have to know all the details, but there's a sense that God exists. You don't have to know exactly who that God is or how that God operates to know that there's a God that exists. That's the point. Plantinga writes this: the basic idea is that there's a kind of faculty or a cognitive mechanism that is called the sensus divinitatis, a sense of divinity, which in a wide variety of circumstances produces in us beliefs about God. These circumstances, we might say, trigger a disposition to form the beliefs in question. They form the occasion on which those beliefs arise. Under these circumstances, we develop or form theistic beliefs, or rather, these beliefs are formed in us. In the typical case, Plantinga says, we don't consciously choose to have those beliefs. Instead, we find them in ourselves. And so that's just really an interesting an argument to look at. And so all of this suggests that an awareness of God is natural. It's widespread. It's not easy to forget. It's not easy to ignore or to destroy. There's this sense of it. We usually have to talk people out of God, not into God, because there's a sense in us that God exists. And so that brings us to the next argument we're going to look at today, and that's the design argument or the clock argument. Now, before I just dive into this a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about the conflict that we seem to have between science and faith. Really, more specifically, science and religion. And I think there's a conflict, and there's animosity on both sides. Those who are firmly rooted in faith have a problem with science and think that science is going to be a problem. Those who are firmly rooted in science think that religion is just something we made up to make ourselves feel better. So there's this idea, certainly in our culture today, that science and faith are in opposition. But I want to challenge us to recognize that that's not really the case. Science and faith do not have to be in conflict. Now, certainly, faith and scientific naturalism are going to be in conflict because faith argues that there's a God, and scientific naturalism argues that there is no God. So there's some conflict there. But what Meyer and lots of Christian scientists want to say is there's no inherent conflict between faith and science. Some of the earliest and most famous scientists that we know pursued the study of science and uncovering the mysteries of nature because they believed that they were created by the same intelligent and rational creator who had created us. So the creator who created the world created us, and therefore we could discover the world. We could know something about this creator because of how we're created and how the world's created. So that they actually pursued science because they believed they could find the same things over and over again, the same laws that are in nature. You know, people say things like this, the miracle of flight. How many of you think flying on an airplane is a miracle? That's why you get on airplanes. If you thought it was a miracle, you wouldn't get on the plane, right? Flying in an airplane is the furthest thing from a miracle. Flying on an airplane is, we do it because they understand the laws of how it works. And it works almost every time. It rarely fails. Now, in the scope of everything, if you're on the plane that fails, it's a pretty serious thing for you. But, really and truly, it's such a big deal when an airplane crashes, especially an airliner, the big planes, because they just it doesn't happen very often, because we understand how those laws work, and so we can repeat the things that happen. And so that's the idea behind the early scientists, or they were called natural philosophers. Meyer argues in the book, since nature's been designed by the same rational mind who had designed the human mind, the early modern scientists, or natural philosophers, who began to investigate nature also assumed that nature was intelligible. It could be understood by the human intellect. The founders of modern science assumed that if they studied nature carefully, it would reveal its secrets because it was intelligible. So we don't want to fall into that trap of thinking, science is like evil and faith is good. Science is brilliant. It's wonderful. And there's so much to be learned. It's amazing what science has done for us. That's kind of been rough the last few years, because I don't know about you, but if I hear, follow the science one more time, it's like, follow the science. Okay, which one? But the reality still is that science is fascinating, and we learn so much. Philosopher of science Steve Fuller, writing in Science versus Religion, notes that Western science is grounded in the belief that the natural order is the product of a single intelligence from which our own intelligence descends. That's why nature is intelligible. The astronomer Johannes Kepler, who lived from 1571 to 1630 and apparently was not always in a good mood, said that God wanted us to recognize natural laws, and God has made this possible by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. It was funny when I found this picture of Kepler. I was like, man, he doesn't seem happy. But he was an intelligent guy, and he said God wanted us to recognize the natural laws, and he made it possible for us to understand nature. Because we were created in his image, we could share his own thoughts. This is what drove science in the early days. And so we don't want to get caught in thinking that we have to choose science or faith. Again, when we look back on the pandemic, for instance, there became this major clash. And I know that it was confusing. I know that there was so much said, and that created problems. But there became this major clash between the church and the state because of follow the science and all the stuff that was going on. And that can create in us this sense that we're in opposition. But that's not necessarily true. William Dembski, in his book Intelligent Design, The Bridge Between Science and Theology, gives us this filter for design that we're going to talk about, which he titles the complexity specification criterion. And here's where we get to the clock. So just think about this complexity specification criterion. Now, here's the classic argument. This comes from William Paley. He says, and this is back in the 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s. Paley says this: if I were walking through a field, if I'm crossing a field, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone. He was British. Suppose I tripped on a stone. I wouldn't think much of that. I probably wouldn't. I wouldn't wonder, well, who put that there? Or where did it come from? It's just a stone. You wouldn't, if you walked across the field over there and you stumbled over a tumbleweed, you wouldn't think, weird. You think, yeah, they're here. But if I continue across the field and come across a watch, then I would be intrigued. I would pick it up and I would look at it. I would perhaps pop the back off the watch and notice inside the bushings and the gears in quite an amazing arrangement. Everything within the watch would have to be in precise arrangement in order for the watch to work, in order for the watch to tell the exact time. It must be well designed. The watch, Paley concludes, points us to a watchmaker. And that's the idea of intelligent design. The case that the intelligent design community is making is that we see a finely tuned universe, exponentially more complex than the most fantastic watch. Where do we see it? Well, we see it in the fine tuning of the universe. The universe is created in just such a way. The parameters required for the universe to hold together and for human life to exist are extremely fine. The Earth's distance from the sun, the moon's distance from the earth, the gravitational force, the cosmological constant. If any of these changed even a tiny bit, none of this would work. It's really, really so specific. There's a great little video. I have it here. For those of you who have DVD players, you can borrow it. It'll be out on the table after the second service. The Privileged Planet. It's just fantastic to note just how finely tuned the universe is and how one little change, if the gravitational force were to change just a tiny bit, life couldn't exist. We know this. One philosopher of science said, it's almost as if the world were waiting for us to get here. Like, this is the world that will let life exist. And so we see it in the fine-tuning of the universe. We see it in the incredible complexity of living organisms. When Darwin wrote Origin of Species, he couldn't see the incredibly complex insides of a cell. DNA hadn't been discovered. They didn't know what they didn't know. He hadn't mapped DNA to understand the vast amount of information it contained. You think about the DNA of a human person. It's like a computer code that's written within the human person, and there's so much information within a computer code that you see that, and you see design, you see purpose behind it. There's another fascinating video that you can watch, and you might be able to find these online, I don't know. Unlocking the Mystery of Life. This one is really interesting because it actually breaks down what's in the DNA and what's in the cell and the little machines that operate within it. There's a couple of videos online you can find that show you how DNA is replicated. It's just unbelievable. And so the more that we can see, the more science we do, the more we understand design. I read the other day, someone wrote this: a little bit of science can make you an atheist, but a lot of science won't. Because the more we learn, the more we recognize that there's design in what we see. And so Dembski developed this complexity specification criteria to give us a filter for knowing when we're looking at design. Now, the first test of the filter is contingency. So when you look at something, so contingency means this: if you're walking across the field and you find a stone, that doesn't meet the contingency requirement because there's stones everywhere. So it's contingent. That stone is contingent on its environment. It exists there because that's what's in the environment. You look at the field across the street, you can say, okay, there are tumbleweeds everywhere. They're contingent on their environment. This is what grows here. So if you see things like that, you think, oh, they're there by necessity because that's where stones are. That's where tumbleweeds are. So that's not going to meet the criterion. And so that's contingency. But if you find a watch, that does meet the criterion, right? Because there's nothing around that watch that would tell you this should be here. And that's really interesting when you look at the universe, that the Earth exists, but none of the other planets that we know of have any kind of life or have the capacity to keep life alive in the way that the Earth does. It's so finely tuned. You go, it does. I mean, looking at the universe wouldn't make you think there would be a planet in the middle of it that just happens to produce life and allow complex life to exist. It's not contingent with everything else. It's unique in its place. That's the idea of the privileged planet. And so the reason that you wouldn't think much about hitting your foot against a stone in a field is that you expect stones to be in the field, and there are probably a lot of them. The stone is there because that's where you expect to find stones, but you wouldn't expect to find a watch. The watch in the field meets the contingency criteria because there's nothing in the field that would lead you to believe it should be there. That's the contingency criteria. The second test is complexity. Is it sufficiently complex to point to design? Now, you could find a stick stuck in the ground in the middle of a field, and you could watch that stick and the shadow that stick casts as the sun moves. And it could be kind of a simple, like a sundial. You could notice things changing. But the stick could have easily gotten there just because it just got there. It's not sufficiently complex to say, hey, this is design. When I was in high school, I worked at a lumber yard, and the guy that owned the lumber yard was a delightful guy, but he was grumpy. And he would once in a while say funny things to us. I mean, I was just in high school, so I was literally at, a 3-inch head and a 12-inch neck. And he kind of got upset with a couple of us one day, and he came out and said, you know what, guys, I can replace you with a very simple tool, a rock and a stick. He was just saying, look, you're just a lever, right? And we know this is true, right? If you take a board and you put it over, you can get some leverage, and you can lift more than you can lift by yourself. That's a simple machine. So if I'm walking in a field and I find a board over a rock, I might think, oh, wow, somebody put that there. It's a lever. But it's not significantly complex to prove design as it would be if I were walking across that field and I found a crane that was really specifically designed, was incredibly complex, and seemed to have some purpose. And so the watch, we find it in the field, upon examination, proves to be significantly complex. It's arranged orders, its gears and mechanism, it points to design. That's the actual back of my friend's watch. It used to be my friend's watch. And then the third test of the filter is specification. Does it have specification? What does it do? The watch meets the specification criteria because it has a very specific purpose. It has the purpose of telling you the time so that you are able to show up on time to church. for instance. There's a purpose behind it, and we can see it. And so this is the idea of the complexity specification criterion, that we can see design, we can measure design. It's not, if it's not contingent with its environment, if it's sufficiently complex, and if it is also made for a purpose, we can say that was designed for something. And so that's the argument of the intelligent design community, that this world that we live in is sufficiently complex. It has so much purpose in it. We see telos in the universe. There's purpose, meaning, that we would say that's design. And we see design everywhere. And we take design for granted. Imagine how many things you've used since you woke up this morning that have such incredible complexity that you completely take for granted. I mean, just your coffee maker. The coffee maker we have a really specific coffee routine at our house. I make the coffee the night before. I set it to come on automatically. Charlene wakes up exactly the same time every day. When she gets up, she does a couple things, and when she gets downstairs, you know what's waiting for her is a cup of coffee. It's done. It's made. And that's a pretty simple machine. But it's more complex. I mean, you would look at that and go, there's design. I use my iPad for my alarm clock. I mean, this is probably a more powerful computer than, it's just amazing. It's so complex, and we just take it for granted every day. And so design is a powerful argument that even the scientific naturalist atheists have to acknowledge. It's something that everybody recognizes. And the reason I want to say that to you is to say this. We don't have to be afraid of the conversation, because nobody gets it, how exactly these things work. Everybody recognizes it. Richard Dawkins writes, biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed with a purpose. Right? I told you last week about the satchel. If it looks like it was designed with a purpose, maybe it was. Francis Crick, who along with James Watson was credited with the discovery of the double helix of DNA in 1953, wrote this: "We must constantly remind ourselves that while what we see gives the appearance of being designed, it was not. It evolved." I love that, right? Like, you have to continually remind yourself that everything you believe about this, and everything that's intuitive about this, and everything that you would know about this, given everything else in the universe, it's not what you think. So everybody's wrestling with this. It's a problem. It's a problem even for those who don't believe in God. They recognize the look of design is everywhere. And so as followers of Jesus, of people who believe that there's a God who created us, we don't have to be afraid of the conversation. The simple point is that we see design in the universe. It would be the craziest thing imaginable to be walking across a field and come on a Rolex and convince yourself that that was there by random chance, that it was made by random chance, that somehow that just happened to exist, given any amount of time you want to put to it. You would never think that. And so we see design in nature. We see design. And so in that, we assume a designer. And also we see it in Scripture. Scripture affirms design. I love Job chapter 38. It just goes on and on. Job is wrestling with God, and God finally says, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words of knowledge, without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you will make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or on what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling hand, and prescribed limits for and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no further, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it?" It's just like this God saying, I designed this. Where were you when I put all this together? I mean, I don't know. When was the last time you were standing on the ocean shore and you were not overwhelmed by the immensity of it, and also that it doesn't spill over on you? How does it stay there? Well, we know that the moon really changes the tide, the gravitational force of the moon. It's amazing. It's incredible that it works. And God's, it's a system that's self-perpetuating. One of the interesting things about a Rolex, by the way, is most of them are self-winding. You don't even have to wind it. It winds itself as you move. And so it's incredible. It's not only a system that's designed, but it's designed to be perpetually working. Think about the way that the earth is created, just the way that water works, right? That water evaporates into the clouds, and it goes and it hits against a mountain, and the rain comes out, it falls into rivers, and it goes back to the ocean. It's an amazing system that's self-perpetuating. And so these are important things to see. We see God in everything. And then the last part of this metaphor, a law-governed realm. When we talk about the laws of nature, we're talking in part about what holds the universe together and makes it habitable for human persons to live on it, what scientists call the anthropic fine-tuning problem. Now, the reason that the anthropic fine-tuning problem is a problem is because those who don't believe that there's a creator find that it's a problem. How do we explain this? It's a challenge. But we see this anthropic fine-tuning principle of the universe. That is to say that the universe is created and our planet is created for human life to exist. Reading in the Return of the God Hypothesis, Meyer writes this: we apparently live in a kind of Goldilocks universe, where the fundamental forces of physics have just the right strengths, the contingent properties of the universe have just the right characteristics, and the initial distribution of matter and energy at the beginning exhibited just the right configuration to make life possible. These facts, taken together, are so puzzling that physicists have given them a name: the fine-tuning problem. Everything is exactly the way it should be. It's a Goldilocks universe. It's not too much and it's not too little. It's just right. If any of these properties were altered even slightly, complex chemistry and life would simply cease to exist. And so we see this fine-tuning in the universe. It's governed by law. There are lots of natural laws, laws of nature. But we also find another type of law in our own human experience, and that's the moral law. I went to get a haircut on Friday, and it was really busy at Great Clips. I go to Great Clips. It's almost like Christmas. You never know exactly how things are going to turn out, right? I mean, yeah. So I do my online check-in, and I go to Great Clips, and it's like a 60-minute wait time, so I set my alarm for 45 minutes, and 45 minutes I drive down there, and the place is packed. There's no place inside to sit, and so I'm like, that's okay. I'm third on the list, so I'm sitting outside, just kind of hanging around the yogurt shop and just waiting for my turn, and this older lady comes up. Turns out that she was 86. And she looked inside. She had signed in online as well, but she could see there was no place to sit. So she just was kind of loitering out front, and I was loitering out there. And I said, so I struck up a conversation with her, as I tend to do with people. I said, yeah, hey, it's a long wait today. She goes, yeah, it's a really big line. I think I'll just wait out here. I said, that's okay. Immediately when she started talking, I knew she wasn't from here. She was British. And I could hear it in her accent. So I was thinking, should I ask her, do I want to know the story? And I kind of did. So I said, so you're not from here. Where did you come from? She said, you can notice the accent. I said, I can. It's not super strong, but I do notice it. And she goes, yeah, well, I grew up just a little bit south of Birmingham in the UK. I was like, I have friends in Birmingham. I have friends who live there. And so we started talking about that. I said, when did you come here? Well, I came here 53 years ago. Been living here ever since. Our whole family immigrated, my husband and my 2 kids and myself, and we moved to Moose Lake. We've been in Moose Lake ever since we moved here. After a few years we lived here, my husband and I got divorced, but then I got remarried, and then my husband of my second marriage died 25 years ago. And so I've been alone since then. And I said, this is interesting. We're talking about our story. And then she looks at me and she says, I think I'm going to go in. This has probably been about 15 minutes, 20. I think I'm going to go in. You think anyone there will give an old lady a chair? And I said, I don't know, but I hope they do. And she went in, and as soon as she went in, the guy stood up and she got the chair. That's the moral law at work in the world. There's something that tells us that I need to give an older person a seat. Like if I'm young and I'm able-bodied, it used to be this way. If you're a guy, you'd give a seat to a lady. It probably still should be that way. And a lot of us operate on that, right? But there's something that tells us we need to care for other people. There's this moral law that's actually woven into us that tells us there's right and there's wrong. We think about World War II. We think about Hitler. We don't think that Hitler was just one way and there are other ways to be. We think that was wrong to annihilate millions of Jews. We don't think of that as just a random, like, oh, well, that's his idea and other people have other ideas. We have this moral law that's woven into us, like the sensus divinitatis. C.S. Lewis writes about this in a number of places, but notably in Mere Christianity, also in The Abolition of Man. But he says, the idea was that just as all bodies are governed by the law of gravitation and organisms by biological laws, so the creature called man also had his law with this great difference, that a body could not choose whether it obeyed the law of gravitation or not, but a man could choose either to obey the law of human nature or to disobey it. But we understood that it was there. This moral code that's written in the heart, and it's transcendent. And this is the case before Christianity. Like the early Greek philosophers were looking for ethics, right? And they believed that these things transcended, that they came down from someplace else. They weren't random, but they were coming to us from somewhere, and they could be counted on. So this isn't even, again, specifically a Christian idea, but it's an idea that's held forth. So if we have this moral code, which covers, again, cultures and tribes and tongues. I mean, there are little differences within our moral code. There may be tribes that have polygamy. Like you can have multiple wives, but it's still not okay to take someone else's wife, right? There's an interesting study of a cannibalistic tribe that the way that they would find people is that they would find people out in the woods, and they would invite them back, and then they would befriend them a little bit until they got comfortable, then they'd eat them. I mean, lots of ways to find food. But it wasn't okay in that tribe to eat someone else in the tribe. You see, there was a moral code. I mean, as funky as it was, as long as they don't live in your tribe, they're fair game. But if they live in, so there's this moral code that transcends. Lewis goes on to say, this law was called the law of nature because people thought that everyone knew it by nature and did not need to be taught it. They did not mean, of course, that you might not find an odd individual here or there who did not know it, just as you find a few people who are colorblind or have no ear for a tune. But taking the race as a whole, they thought that the human idea of decent behavior was obvious to everyone. And so we recognize that this is in our human experience. It's transcendent. There's a law that transcends us in this community, us in this country, us in this moment of history. This law that transcends, that we know is there, that God has placed in our heart. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 2, verses 12 through 16. He says, for all who have sinned without the law will perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. It's not the hearers of the law, but the doers of the law who are justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. What Paul's saying is they're Gentiles, they're not Jews, and they haven't been given the law, but they keep the law because they understand it's the right thing to do. And keeping the law is the right thing to do. And it shows that the law is written on our hearts, that it transcends from God and is written in our very nature. And so that points us back to God. And so we look at these arguments and we say, there's reasons to believe that we are here on purpose. Now I know that I'm preaching to the choir here. But I want to say to us, we can talk to people about these things. We need to keep calm. We have reasons to believe that are reasonable, that are even scientific, that fit within philosophy and theology. We don't have to be afraid of the conversation, and we shouldn't be afraid of the conversation. A few other arguments that are interesting. Argument from rationality. If our rationality, this is the way the argument goes, if our rational minds came about by random chance and happenstance, then how do we trust that? Because it's random. I'm not going to go any further with that argument, just to toss it out there. It's there. The argument from consciousness. This is the argument that claims that human consciousness cannot be explained by the naturalistic means. It's not material. The physical mechanisms of the human body and brain cannot account for the non-physical aspects of human consciousness. Have you thought about that much? It's a really interesting idea. That is to say, you have a soul. You aren't your brain. Now, one of the ways that they study this, and this is so fascinating, is near-death experiences. When I was doing my master's degree at Biola, one of my professors was Gary Habermas, and he'd done lots and lots of studies, probably one of the top 2-3 guys in the world on the resurrection. But he was talking in the class about near-death experiences, and I got to have dinner with him later that night with a group of students, and he was talking about near-death experiences. And this person died, they died on the operating table, and they were aware, and when they came back to their bodies, they said, hey, by the way, on top of the hospital, behind that smokestack, there's a tennis shoe. Like, how could that be? Somebody went up there, and there was a tennis shoe. Another person's experience was they died on the operating table. There were 2 doctors, a younger doctor and an older doctor, and the person died, and the younger doctor was saying, hey, this thing is over. We need to call it. We need to be done. And the older doctor was like, no, we need to keep going. I think we can save this person's life. And they did. The person came out of it, and the person said to the younger doctor, why'd you give up? It's seen it, right? It's a good reason to go to older doctors, by the way. Now, Gary Habermas was telling these stories to us, and I said, I just couldn't take it anymore, because I'd never really heard anybody seriously talk about this. And I finally said to him, do you talk out loud about this to other people? Like in other scientists, other apologists? Because it sounds crazy. And he said, oh no, this is not crazy. This is real science. This is work that we've done. We know this stuff. And so here's what we know. We're not our bodies. Who we are fundamentally is not, there's something else to us that's not material. We're not just machines made of meat. There's something more to us that no amount of naturalistic science can prove. It's not matter, and it wasn't evolved. It's something that's in us that was put there. And so we see this over and over in the world. We see design everywhere. We see things that are really, really, really challenging to explain apart from a creator. I don't know if you ever saw the video Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. It was a movie that Ben Stein made. And in this movie, he interviews a bunch of scientists, and it's an interesting movie. If you haven't seen it, maybe go see if you can find it. But he interviews Richard Dawkins, and I just want to give you, just as I wrap this up, just this little interview that he did with Dawkins. He says, well then, Ben Stein says, who created the heavens and the earth? Dawkins says, why do you use the word who? It begs the question. Well, then how did it get created? Well, Dawkins says, a very slow process. Okay, so how did it get started? Dawkins says, nobody knows how it got started. We know the kind of event it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life. Well, what was that? It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule. Okay, well, how did that happen? I told you, we don't know. So you don't know how it got started? No, nor has anyone. Well, what do you think is the possibility, Stein says, that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some answers in genetics or Darwinian evolution? Here's Richard Dawkins' answer. Fantastic. It could come about in the following way. At some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto this planet. Now that is a possibility, an intriguing possibility. I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the cells of biochemistry and molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of a designer, and that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe, but that higher intelligence would have had to itself come about by some explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point. This is how powerful the design argument is. Ben Stein says, well, how did it happen? Dawkins, with a straight face, says, well, it's possible that there's another higher intelligence somewhere else in the world who seeded life on this planet. Okay, that's a serious conversation in this issue, but it tells us how powerful it is. Somebody else had to have designed it somewhere else and then brought it here. Now, all you've done then is just, what Meyer says, you would just kick the problem out into space. But it tells us that those who so firmly believe that we came about by the evolutionary process by chance. Can't explain it. And it's not getting easier to explain. And so we keep calm, give an answer. We can't prove God's existence, but we can surely be engaged in the conversation and learn to ask questions. You know, it's better to ask good questions than it is to act like we have all the answers. And so nobody gets it. Nobody really knows. The atheistic natural scientists do not know how we came to be here. Even though the common paradigm, the narrative that we're living in is that we live in a world that came about by chance. There's no way to show that that's the case. And so how do we go about this? Well, we prepare. I mean, you know, there's so much great information that you can get hold of. You prepare your heart and your head and your hands. Who are the people in our life who need to come to the kingdom? Who are the people you can have conversations with? It'd be fun to just start having conversations about some of the stuff that maybe is just out there. Ask God to help you and to give you opportunity. What are the opportunities that you have to have conversations? We've been praying that prayer of approach. God, give me creativity and an imaginative way to talk with people about faith. Because there's stuff that we can get our heads and our hands around. And then pursue with boldness and gentleness and respect the opportunities that are presented to us. I just say to you again, I've loved watching all these interviews with Stephen Meyer because he just doesn't get goaded into making fun of people. As followers of Jesus, that should be the last thing on our mind. And we tend to do that when we feel like we don't have answers. It's okay to say, I don't have answers. But it's also okay to say, I'm not sure anybody else does either. So let's talk about that. Right? And so, where are the opportunities? Where can we speak into the world? Let's speak this prayer together again. We've been talking about this prayer of approach. It's a couple down, Brody, I think. Yeah, there it is. Let's pray this prayer together at the bottom of this slide. Creator God, ignite in me a fresh creativity and a deeper passion to share your gospel. Inspire me to respond imaginatively to the people and events I encounter so that my whole life points more clearly to Jesus. Let's pray. Lord, thank you. Thank you for your faithfulness. Awaken in us hearts and minds that want to seek out some of the answers to these questions. Not that we're all going to be scientists or that we're all going to be apologists. We're not. But in some way, you've called each of us to be ready to give an answer as we've been looking at the words of Peter in 1 Peter 3. That we need to be ready to give an answer for the hope that's within us, but with gentleness and respect. Thank you for your faithfulness to us. And help us to be faithful to you, to pursue the opportunities that you give us to have conversations. We're just grateful for the opportunity to be ambassadors of your kingdom. And so inspire us to do that, to be the voice in our culture, to be the voice in the people that we spend time with as we walk out this journey of faith that you've drawn us into. In Jesus' name, amen.